Recently, I've been playing through Bravely Default 2 live right here on this channel. Check out the other links in the description. And it's really gotten me thinking about how we judge RPGs. There are obviously a ton of comparisons drawn between Bravely Default 2 and Final Fantasy, as it clearly takes inspiration from the renowned franchise. But I've come to realize that many RPGs, JRPGs in particular, are always put to the quote-unquote Final Fantasy standard. I felt like it would be worthwhile today to discuss why so many of us in this community fall into this habit, and furthermore I'd like to take a look at if this is a fair or effective way of evaluating other RPGs. My name is the Ashen Dragoon, and here on this channel I make videos covering gaming and gaming news with a focus on RPGs. I also make in-depth analysis videos on the games that I love, so if you do like the video, remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon to get notifications every time that I upload. Now, back in the mid to late 80s, Square was not the RPG powerhouse that it's known to be today, and in fact, many of the games Square made would surprise you if you saw them now. Final Fantasy was Hironobu Sakaguchi's and possibly even Square's last-ditch effort into the gaming industry. If it failed, he would go back to university and pursue a more traditional career path. The game clearly drew inspiration from Enix's Dragon Quest series. Two fun little facts here. Many people don't know that Dragon Quest is actually older than FF, and many younger fans didn't know that Square and Enix used to be two separate companies before they merged in 2003. While Dragon Quest is slightly older than Final Fantasy, it certainly did not catch on like FF did in the West. The original game was a massive hit, and immediately a sequel was put into production. The rest, as they say, is history, and I don't think we actually need to get into that history too much, but I do think it's actually important to note how the franchise burst into the scene. As the series continued to grow with subsequent entries, I think it's only really natural that such a popular franchise would be what people compare other games in the genre to, and I think this was especially true after Final Fantasy VII brought a massive influx of players into the genre who had really never played a JRPG before. So with so many people who had only played one RPG or one franchise, it really became the best frame of reference or the only frame of reference to communicate between casual JRPG fans. I mean, I've constantly heard Final Fantasy referenced when talking about Xenoblade, Persona, Nier, Megami Tensei, Disgaea, Dragon Quest, Kingdom Hearts, and yes, even Pokemon. And that's just a short list of some of the games I've heard comparisons with. I've even heard some Western RPGs compared before. I know that this sounds crazy, guys, as these games really aren't at all alike, but I think that it's inevitable to a certain extent. I see this similarly to how Battlefield, despite being a successful franchise in its own right, is constantly compared to Call of Duty with each one of its releases. While on one end, linking a different game to something familiar can lead to more open minds willing to dive into a new franchise, on the other hand, it kind of forces the game that's being compared to the bigger franchise to live in its shadow. Even if in all reality they are different games, not even really trying to accomplish the same thing. So comparing other games to Final Fantasy can definitely be a double-edged sword, and we need to be careful with how we do it. We need to look at on a case-by-case basis whether the parallels drawn are fair, and we need to ensure that we aren't labeling a truly unique experience as Final Fantasy clones. I'm not naive enough to think that we can just completely stop these comparisons, and I don't even want to do that. Personally, I know I'll be guilty of over-comparing in the future. I just think we need to be mindful. I think another aspect that we need to take a look at is how effective these comparisons even are. I know that when a lot of people think about Final Fantasy or reference Final Fantasy, they're talking about 1 through 10. Even though these games do share a ton of similarities and consistency, it's really impossible to ignore the evolution of the franchise. Let's take a look at the big picture of the franchise. We're going to examine Final Fantasy I and the most recent mainline title, Final Fantasy 15. Now, if these games did not have the same title, Final Fantasy, there's pretty much nothing that would clue you in that they belong to the same series. They just are completely different experiences with very little in common. I know this is an extreme example, but I like to point it out. Even if we take a look at a non-extreme example, I still find it very fascinating. Let's look at the differences between Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy VII. While these games are both JRPGs and they're both, between the numbers 1 and 10 like I talked before, these JRPGs are quite different and really do provide a quite different experience when playing. And to me, that's what makes pinning down what Final Fantasy is somewhat difficult. I've heard members in the community often refer to the spirit of Final Fantasy. Oh God, no, not that movie. Not that movie. All jokes aside, guys, I think the spirit of Final Fantasy is subjective and it really varies quite a bit from person to person. It really all depends on how old you are, how old you were when you played the games for the first time, which games you have played, and whether storytelling is valued over gameplay. All of these factors are unique to each and every person who plays these games. Some people may prefer the melodramatic stories and that's why they're here for Final Fantasy. Others might be more interested in the battles and gameplay. Some might value character development and others may prefer crafting the perfect party combinations. You get my point. Really what I'm trying to say is that Final Fantasy means different things to different people. We may think it's obvious that when people compare games like Bravely Default 2 to Final Fantasy, they're referring to the NES and SNES titles, and not Final Fantasy 15. However, this might not be the case with all people who hear these comparisons, and that's why I think sometimes doing such comparisons could potentially be confusing, especially as we get farther and farther into the modern Final Fantasy era. Final Fantasy has such a long and rich history that it simply may not be fitting to use it so broadly when it comes to comparisons. But now I want to know what you guys think. Do we compare too many other RPGs, JRPGs specifically to Final Fantasy? Is this a fair or effective way of discussing other games? And has a game being compared to Final Fantasy ever convinced you to play it? I'm really curious about that. Let me know the answers to all those questions down in the comments below. Once again, if you did like the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to get notified every time that I upload. I'm going to keep making more gaming content with a focus on RPGs. Also, check out the links in the description below if you're interested in my live streams. Currently, I'm playing through Bravely Default 2 right here on this channel as well as on Twitch and in Facebook. I'm also planning, in honor of this video, to have my next video be the top 5 non-Square Enix RPGs. So I think that will be interesting, especially considering today's discussion. Until the next one, thanks for stopping by.